Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture on discourse analysis. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the field of discourse analysis while visiting some of the key terms used in the field of discourse analysis. The goal of this lecture is to understand what we mean by the term discourse and how the field of discourse analysis has developed. So this is going to provide us with some background to understand what is coming in the rest of the lectures. What is discourse? Discourse refers to actual instances of communicative action in the medium of language. So what do you mean by actual instances of communicative action? Well, we use language for communication all the time. Whether it is at home, whether it is at the supermarket, whether it is at the workplace, or when you go out and hang out with your friends, you use language to communicate. So those are actual instances of communicative action. If you hang out with your friends and if you talk about various things, and that is an actual instance of communicative action, and that uses language. And if it is communication or if it is a conversation at home, you use language for that conversation. If it is at a supermarket, if you go to a supermarket and if you try to buy something, and you may communicate with the people at the supermarket. So there you use language for communication, and that is an actual instance of communication or communicative action that uses language. So in all these situations, language that we produce can be called a discourse. You're producing a discourse. So discourse is actual language that we use to communicate in a particular situation. Language that you use at a supermarket, language that you use at home, language you use when you hang out with your friends, or language that you use when you write an article, when you write an email. So all these are actual instances of communicative action. So your language in all these situations, whether it is a spoken language or written language, can be called discourse. So we have two varieties of discourse: written discourse and spoken discourse. So written discourse is basically the type of language or the kind of language that we produce in writing. If we write a note, if we write a notice, when we write an essay, academic article, an email, memo, whatever the form of writing you're doing, the language that you use in that form of writing can be considered a discourse. So you're producing discourse. And then you have spoken discourse. So spoken discourse is language that we produce in spoken communication in a particular instance. Whether it is at a party, whether it is at formal communication, whether it is at a family conversation, at workplace. So we produce a spoken discourse. Suppose you are at an academic lecture. Now the language that the lecturer uses can be called or considered spoken discourse as well. News bulletin is a spoken discourse. Weather report is also spoken discourse. A wedding speech, a funeral speech. So all these are examples of spoken discourse. So in simple terms, Discourse can be used to refer to, the term discourse can be used to refer to actual instances of communicative action that depends on or that uses language. And then we have two varieties of discourse, written discourse and spoken discourse. So written discourse is the type of language or the kind of language that we use in written communication. And spoken discourse is the language that we use in spoken communication. And there are various examples of written discourse, and there are various examples of spoken discourse. Now, having understood what we mean by discourse and also those two varieties of discourse, written discourse and spoken discourse, now let's look at this simple exercise. So this is not really a simple exercise, but let's look at this exercise and see whether you can translate these lines or quotations into your native language. So read carefully and see whether you can translate this into native language. Well, you may realize that translating these expressions is not very easy. Now, if you take the first one, may the force be with you, even when we know that it is coming from Star Wars movies. Translating that is not easy. And translating the quotation from Shakespeare's Hamlet is not easy. Why? Well, in order to translate something, as the translator, we need to know a bit more about these quotations, each of these quotations. So what are some of the things that we need to know in order to translate these quotations? Or what are some of the decisions that we have to make in translating these quotations? We have to ask ourselves, are there grammatical possibilities in English that do not exist in another of your languages or the language that you're trying to translate it into, and vice versa? So can I translate it in the same way? Do I have grammatical possibilities? Because languages are different in terms of the repertoire of grammatical structures. And in addition to those structural constraints that we have to take into consideration, we also have to take into consideration the situational context of the utterance. Who would say things like this? Now, who is actually saying this? To whom is this being said? And in what circumstances? So what is the circumstance, or what is the situation in which this is said? So why would these things be said? So why is this utterance actually made? Without knowing the background of these utterances, nothing can be translated. Are they usually said in writing or orally or in other media? So what is the medium? What is the kind of discourse? Is this written discourse or spoken discourse? Do we say this in writing or in speech? That is also important. And now in a language like Sinhala, we make certain changes in the structure depending on whether we are translating something into spoken language or written language. Even though we have agreement and many grammatical features in the written language, for example, mama, yami, api, yamu. So that's what we call agreement. In spoken language, we have more freedom. Mama yanava, api yanava, ya yanava. So there's more freedom. But we can make those changes only if the language that we are using is spoken language. So we need to know the context of the utterance, whether we have the grammatical possibilities in the language that we are translating it into, and is this written language or spoken language? Without knowing this, translation is impossible. So one thing that we realize from this exercise is that any discourse that we produce is closely linked to a context. It is context dependent. Without understanding the context of an utterance, we cannot translate that, or we cannot make the complete sense of it, or we cannot completely understand what it means or what each utterance means without knowing the context. For example, that's water under the bridge. That is an idiomatic expression. But where is this said? So the simple meaning is there's no point in being sad about something or worrying about something that is over. But what is the context in which this is said? So who is this? Who is saying this to whom? In what context? So language is closely linked to a discourse context. Without understanding the discourse context, or without knowing the discourse context, we cannot completely understand what the utterance says. And that's the one thing we realize from this exercise, how discourse is linked to a particular situation. Now, let's ask ourselves, what is discourse analysis? Discourse analysis is a broad term that refers to approaches for analyzing spoken and written language as texts. In discourse analysis, which is a subfield in linguistics, we look at, or we use various approaches to analyze spoken and written language as texts. So this text is a common term that we will be using in the rest of the class or in the rest of this course. Any discourse can be considered a text. A letter written by somebody is a text. An email is a text. A memo is a text. A text message is also a text. Even in the domain of spoken discourse, now let's say a speech, political speech, we would call it a text. A funeral speech or a wedding speech or academic lecture, whatever we are referring to, we would use the term the text to refer to it. So texts are what we are going to analyze. So discourse analysis is a broad term that refers to approaches for analyzing spoken and written language as text. So we are going to analyze a spoken text as well as written texts. Language in those texts. Drawing on work from linguistics, sociology, and anthropology, discourse analysis embraces the view that to understand language, one must view it in context. So discourse analysis is not only dependent on linguistics. It is drawing on work from a variety of disciplines: linguistics, sociology, anthropology. So anthropology is a discipline that studies about humans. So human interaction, human culture. So we are drawing from all these fields. In addition to this, there are also other fields which are contributing to discourse analysis. For example, cognitive science. So linguistics, sociology, anthropology, cognitive science. So drawing on work from these fields, discourse analysis embraces the view that to understand language, one must view it in context. So you have to see the context in which that text is produced, language is produced. Even if it is a single phrase, even if it is a single utterance, in order to understand that, you need to know which context it is produced in. The focus of discourse analysis is language beyond sentence boundary. So this is very important. So what are we focusing on in discourse analysis? The focus of discourse analysis is not anything below the sentence level. Now in linguistics, in linguistic classes or language classes that you have taken, you must have analyzed language at various levels. You look at the sound system of a particular language at the level of phonology. And you look at the word formation of a language at the level of morphology. You look at the structure of language at the level of syntax. And you look at how language or how language generates meaning, or how meaning works in a language at the level of semantics and pragmatics. So those are structural levels at which language can be analyzed. But in discourse analysis, our focus is on language beyond sentence boundary, above the sentence level. And that is something that is not discussed in structural analysis of language. In phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax. So we don't look at beyond sentence boundary. What is happening beyond sentence boundary? How is language actually used in communication in different contexts? So that is not something we generally look at in the structural analysis of language. For example, in syntax, we analyze individual sentences. We analyze them in terms of phrases, clauses, questions. But we don't analyze them to see how they are actually used in real communication. Discourse analysis focuses on naturally occurring language use, both in writing and speech. So discourse analysis is not simply looking at language structures that people can produce or people should produce. Discourse analysis looks at language that people actually produce. Now, there are rules that we are supposed to follow in a particular language. These are called prescriptive rules. And that's not what discourse analysis is about. What do people actually do when they use language? Naturally occurring language use. Is naturally occurring language different from language that we study in textbooks, in grammar books? Yes, of course. Carefully concentrate on what you're doing when you use language. Sometimes we use complete sentences when we naturally communicate in spoken language or when we produce a spoken discourse. Sometimes we use only half of the sentence, only a part of the sentence. So we don't have an obligation to complete a sentence in a spoken language. We can simply say a part of the sentence and then the other person may understand us. For example, the grammar book would say, a grammar book for English would say, the perfect way to ask a question would be something like, are you having breakfast? But in naturally occurring language, people would say, instead of asking, are you having breakfast? Which is very formal. People would simply ask, having breakfast? And that's naturally occurring language. Are you going home? So that's the formal question. But people would say something like, going home? So they would drop certain elements of the sentence. So in discourse analysis, we look at what people actually do when they produce language. Could be in the written discourse or spoken discourse. What people actually do in naturally occurring language is certainly different from what they are supposed to do or what they are expected to do, at least according to prescriptive grammar. Let's read this description of discourse analysis as well. Discourse analysis examines patterns of language across texts. So what are different patterns of language that we use? Whether it is in spoken discourse or written discourse, what are different patterns that we use? And considers the relationship between language and the social and cultural context in which it is produced or it is used. One thing that we said right at the beginning of this lecture is that language is, any discourse is closely related to the context in which it is produced. So discourse analysis is after this, and that's what discourse analysis is trying to understand. Discourse analysis examines the pattern of language across texts and considers the relationship between language and the social and cultural context in which it is used. So when we take a text, we would look at how language is actually used in a particular context. Discourse analysis also considers the ways that the use of language presents different views of the world and different understandings. Our language choices are not always innocent. Our language choices announce the kinds of views, perspectives, ideologies that we have about the world. So we present our choice of language presents different views of the world and different understandings. It examines how the use of language is influenced by relationships between participants, as well as the effects the use of language has upon social identities and relations. So all these lines actually express very complex ideas. Discourse analysis looks at how language conveys different ideologies, different views about the world, different perspectives. Our choice of words, our choice of structures, they can convey certain ideologies about the world. It all examines how the use of language is influenced by relationships between participants, as well as the effects the use of language has upon social identities and relations. Our choice of language is influenced by relationships. Suppose when you communicate, suppose you're communicating with your parents. What kind of language choices would you make? You would tend to use some formal language. And if you communicate with classmates, your friends, what kind of language choices would you make? So people would typically say things like, hello, machang, among friends. But it is unlikely that somebody would use, hello, what are you doing, to a parent. When we speak to a parent, so we would make changes to our choice of language. When we talk to a teacher or a lecturer or somebody that we don't know, we may use a different kind of language. Our linguistic choices or language choices are different. So relationships definitely play a major role in our choice of language. And also it has an effect on social identities and relations. It also considers how views of the world and identities are constructed through the use of discourse. Identities, views of the world, or ideologies are constructed through language, especially in a domain called critical discourse analysis. We look at how ideologies get formed, how identities are formed through the use of language. So in that sense, discourse analysis has a very wide scope, and it looks at various aspects. So when we actually do discourse analysis, you will be able to realize different areas that we are looking at in discourse analysis. So it's a broad field. It's a very broad field of study. The term discourse analysis was first used by Selig Harris in 1950s. In a series of articles he wrote on language. Selig Harris is a prominent linguist. And he is actually the father of discourse analysis because he was the one who introduced this term. And he was instrumental in introducing this level of analysis for language. So in 1950s, the dominant approach to linguistics was structuralism. Language was analyzed at different structural levels. People were concerned with the structure of the language. So at a time when structural linguistics was dominant, Harris pointed out that language can also be analyzed at a different level, or language should be analyzed at a different level in order to understand how language actually works, how language is actually used. He introduced the term of discourse analysis as a way of analyzing connected speech and writing. Connected speech and writing means actual language that we use. When we communicate, we produce connected speech. In natural conversation, we are focusing on, when we naturally produce language, we are focusing on the task or the goal. We have the goal of communication. And the language that we produce in spoken, natural language, natural communication is very different from what we have in textbooks. So that's the goal of, that's the focus on discourse analysis. So Harris had two main interests. He wanted to analyze the language beyond the level of the sentence. So as I told you at the beginning, language has been analyzed at various levels, at the phonological level, morphological level, syntactic level, and semantic level. But what is really happening beyond the level of the sentence when we produce a text? And that was not a focus of structural linguistics. And that is what Harris is trying to focus on or analyze. Relationship between linguistic and non-linguistic behavior. So these are the two main interests he had. So we will look at each area. We'll try to understand each area by focusing on them. Language beyond the level of the sentence. Harris observed that there are typical ways of using language in particular situations. So depending on the situation, we would make changes to the way language is used. When we communicate among friends at a party, what kind of language choices do we make? When we take part in a formal discussion at a company, what kind of language do we use? When we attend an academic discussion, what kind of language do we use? So there are typical ways of using language in particular situations. He argued that these discourses shared particular meanings and characteristic linguistic features. So language used in each context, each situation has its own linguistic features. If you carefully analyze, you can identify linguistic features associated with discourses produced in each context. The relationship between linguistic and non-linguistic behavior. So this was the second focus of Harris. Harris refers to how people know from the situation they are in how to interpret what someone says. When we try to interpret something in a particular situation, we are not only dependent on linguistic resources. So that means we are not only making use of structures and words. We also make use of non-linguistic behavior, various other things to understand that sentence. From the situation they are in, people know how to interpret what someone says. Sometimes if we only have access to the linguistic utterance, without knowing the context, it's not easy to interpret it. And that's why when those quotations, when they had been unplugged, when they had been, when they had been chosen from a particular, unplugged from the situation, we had difficulty in translating them. Expressions have a particular meaning in a particular situation and may mean something different in another situation. Take a simple expression. For example, මොකද කරන්නේ? It is an expression. So it has a particular meaning in a particular situation. So it can be used for threatening in a particular situation. It can be used to elicit information in a particular situation. මොකද කරන්නේ? It can be used as a warning in a particular situation. So in order to interpret it, we need to see the situation. We need to know about the situation in which it is used. Now here is an example from one of the articles that I would be assigning you to read. The runway is full at the moment. Now, if you look at this one, this can convey many different meanings. And in order to understand this sentence, we need to know the situation in which it is used. And now see, the runway is full at the moment. How would a pilot understand it? How would a person waiting to pick someone at the airport understand it? Now, suppose there is a flight approaching an airport and the pilot is getting ready to land. But as the pilot is approaching the airport, someone from the control room says the runway is full at the moment. So what is this control? What is the message to the pilot? What is it that the people at the control room or in the control room trying to tell the pilot? So we all understand that this is a request to delay the landing of the flight. So it is not directly said, but these people at the communication room, the control room, are telling the pilot, or informing the pilot that he cannot land at the moment, he or she. So you have to delay landing. And suppose, so that is how the pilot would understand this utterance. So I have to delay the landing because the runway is full at the moment. And now let's see how someone waiting to pick a friend at the airport would understand it. Suppose suppose you are going to, or you are going to the airport to pick someone. And the flight was due 30 minutes ago. looks like it has not arrived still. And you would go to a help desk at the airport and ask, has the flight, let's say UL 302 arrived? And the person at the help desk would not say anything, but would say anything else, but would say the runway is full at the moment. So we would understand it as a message like, okay, the flight hasn't arrived because the flight hasn't landed yet because the runway is full at the moment. So the message is, yeah, the flight hasn't arrived yet. So you can see the same sentence being interpreted in two different ways by two different parties. The pilot would understand it as a message to delay or request to delay the landing of the flight. And then the person who has gone to pick someone at the airport would understand it as a message which says that there is a delay in landing. And the person has to wait more. So the same discourse, so this is a discourse or a text. The same discourse can be understood differently by different language users, as well as understood differently in different contexts. The context that the pilot is in is different from the context that this person is in. Same sentence conveys two different messages in these two different contexts. And they understand two different things. The pilot would understand it as a request to delay the landing, but the person who has gone to the airport to pick someone, that person won't understand it as a request to delay the landing. That person would understand it as simple message. Yeah, the flight is delayed. This is why Arford says that to understand the meaning of what a person says or writes, one needs to know something about the situational and cultural context in which it is located. I think this is one of the main ideas that I've been trying to convey in this lecture. And this is something that discourse analysis is after. Understanding the context or analyzing language at the context in which it is used. If one doesn't know what the people involved in a text are doing and don't understand their culture, then you can't make sense of their text. So when a text is isolated from the context, unplugged from the context, the text may not make complete sense. And that's once again the idea conveyed by Martin 2001. This is why many linguists point out the importance of studying language in naturally occurring situations. Whether it is Michael Halliday, John Sinclair, J.R. Ford, so these are contributors to the field of discourse analysis, and they point out the importance of studying language in naturally occurring situations. Discourse analysis then is interested in what happens when people draw on the knowledge they have about language to do things in the world. So we have knowledge of language inside our head. We have knowledge of language. So we draw on that knowledge of language in a variety of situations when we communicate or when we do things in the actual world. So what happens when people draw on the knowledge they have about language to do things in the world? Whether it is at the supermarket, whether it is at home, whether it is at an academic lecture, whether it is at a party, whether it is at an airport, we make use of the knowledge of language. And what happens when we put that knowledge into practice? Discourse analysis considers the relationship between language and the context in which it is used, and is concerned with the description and analysis of both spoken and written interactions. The focus of discourse analysis is on both written and spoken discourses or interactions. What happens when we write and what happens when we speak? The primary purpose of discourse analysis is to provide a deeper understanding and appreciation of texts and how they become meaningful to their users. How a text becomes meaningful to the users. So the text that I'm using, my academic discourse here, how does it become meaningful to you? And that's the purpose or the goal of discourse analysis, analyzing and understanding how a text becomes meaningful to its users. So discourse analysis from its inception in 1950s has come along, has developed a lot, has come a long way. Today, discourse analysis is not totally a linguistic endeavor. It is not just a linguistic activity. It is not an activity in which we are analyzing language or structures or words or sounds. It is done in a variety of disciplines. So discourse analysis is done in a variety of disciplines: anthropology, sociology, cognitive psychology, social psychology, international relations, communication studies, translation studies. So in all these fields, discourse analysis is conducted to a certain extent. So discourse analysis is useful in a variety of disciplines. So discourse analysis is also contributed by, the field of discourse analysis is also contributed by all these disciplines: anthropology, sociology, cognitive psychology, social psychology, international relations, translation studies, communication studies. So all these fields have contributed to the field of discourse analysis. So in this lecture then, I have provided you with a basic introduction to discourse analysis. And you have been given an introduction to the field, entire field. And you got to know how discourse analysis began and how it has developed over the years. So from here onwards, we will focus on the field of discourse analysis, and we will look at how various discourses can be analyzed, how various genres can be analyzed and have been analyzed in the field of discourse analysis. So this is the end of the introduction. Then in the next lecture, I will introduce some terminology, and after that we will move on to actual analysis of written and spoken discourses. Thank you.